Okay, right. Well, thank you very much for coming along and staying to the very last paper, the very last talk in the very last session of our 2 days here. I must say I've been really impressed by the two earlier speakers, both of whom, of course, are applied scientists in a way. Though I have to say Brooke is obviously using some serious history in part of his talk, which is very good to know. I'm a historian. I work on what might seem a much more recent period than Brooke, because I work on the 16th and the 17th century, mainly in Europe, mainly in Italy. Very different societies to the societies we use today, we have today. And compared to what our two previous speakers have said, I feel rather at a loss, because obviously what I say doesn't really have any obvious real-world significance. Brooke and Tom are both obviously solving problems that trouble us today. And this worries me a bit as a historian, because actually, although I study a slightly more recent period than Brooke, I do actually study real-life problems in the past. Most of my time as a historian I've spent studying really nasty things, like attempts to limit freedom of expression and publication, attempts to persecute minorities, drive people away from societies, violent persecutions, pogroms and things like that. So the sort of things we have all the time now, we read every day in the news, I am actually studying in the 16th and 17th century. So the question arises, how does studying these things in the past help us perhaps solve them or understand them in the present? And I want to spend a couple of minutes now just explaining how this might work for a historian working on my period, and in particular a city I've worked on a lot, as John knows, which is Venice. Venice, of course, is a really weird place in all sorts of ways. Any of you who've been there will realise it's deeply weird. First of all, it's weird because it's built in the sea. This is a rather blurry aerial picture, obviously taken through an aircraft window of Venice. This is actually Venice here, the main city here, but what you've got around it is essentially the north of the Adriatic, and these are all other occupied or unoccupied islands. Venice, the main bit here, is built on hundreds and hundreds of islands in the Adriatic Sea, the top end of the Adriatic Sea. And that means, of course, that it's a very unusual place, because instead of having roads to link bits of the city, it has canals. And this is a picture which Anya would be able to tell you about. I took this picture 3 or 4 weeks ago when I was in Venice, and I was sitting on this canal just looking at, and the cat climbed out through this gate and decided to sit on the boat. And the reason I'm showing you this picture is because that gate there, whoops, shouldn't have done that, that gate there is actually the front door of the house. And the cat, like every cat, wanted to get out a bit of sun. It went and sits on the doorstep in the morning. And so that is what the cat is doing. This is, in fact, the road here. That's how you get around Venice in the early modern period. So it's a really weird sort of place. So weird, in fact, that the American humorist Richard Benchley, just before the Second World War, in his first visit to Venice, sent a telegram to his friend back in the United States saying, "I'm completely confused. I'm here. The streets are full of water. Please advise me what to do." These are streets full of water in Venice. Venice is weird, of course, in all sorts of other respects as well. It is now very seriously troubled by these ghastly, vast boats. I'm sorry if any of you have been on holiday on one of these boats, but when I was there a few weeks ago, I was standing on one of the highest points in a building that most people don't get into, and I suddenly saw this sort of thing, not this one, but a boat like this driving past Venice, and you can just see if it goes 3 yards off, it's going to smash the whole city to smithereens. So it's a very vulnerable location, and it is also hopelessly overcrowded. Something like 25 million visitors now pile into Venice every year, local population 50,000. So you can see it's massively overwhelmed by these ghastly people crowding around. And apologies if, like me, you've spent many hours having to work through these crowds. So it's a very weird place now. It was also a very weird place in the 15th and 16th and 17th centuries. Those are centuries when, on the whole, European states, governments, places like England, places like France, places like Spain, were generally centralising their governments, centralising power more and more into the capital city, often into the hands of a single ruler, the King of England, the King of Spain, the King of France. It's also a period when, on the whole, those rulers are trying to discipline, regulate, control the views, the opinions, the lifestyles of their subjects. They're essentially trying to create a uniform culture within their society. Venice is weird because Venice stands out against both of those trends. First of all, Venice doesn't have a centralised government at all. It retains an extraordinarily decentralised form of government with no single head of state that has any power anyway. The place is run by hundreds of committees where nobody ever sits on them for more than about 2 months maximum at a time. So you've got a constant rotation of office. It's a deeply decentralised system. And secondly, there's no uniform culture. Venice is an extraordinarily multicultural place, and this is just a small detail from a 15th century, late 15th century painting by Carpaccio, and just this small detail you can see, a bunch of Turks up there with white turbans, obviously an Asian person there, African working as a gondolier there. This is very, very typical of Venice. French ambassador in Venice at exactly the same time this painting was painted, in his reports back to the Crown in France, says, "This is a really weird place, everyone seems to be a foreigner." And that is exactly right, they were. 100 years later, at the end of the 16th century, another writer said how wonderful it is to walk around Venice because you see so many different people dressed in so many different costumes, speaking so many different languages. It's an extraordinarily multicultural place. So multicultural, in fact, that the Venetians had to start publishing guidebooks to the sort of people you would meet as you walked around. What costumes they were wearing. If you saw someone wearing this sort of hat, you knew it was obviously someone from Armenia, or someone from Persia, or someone from North Africa, or whatever it happens to be. It's an extraordinary multicultural place. And that is very, very unusual in both counts. Why is Venice so decentralised politically? Why is it so multicultural? Well, I think if you're trying to explain this, the reason it's very difficult is because everyone else at the time argued the opposite. I've got a wonderful report of a conversation between the Pope and the Venetian ambassador in Rome, where the Pope says, your society is absolutely doomed. Your society is doomed. You've got all these people, all these different cultures, all these different races, languages, religions, and so on in your society. We all know that no society can survive for any length of time unless everyone believes the same thing and everyone has the same faith. Venetians just ignored all that. It is true that one or two communities in Venice had some restrictions imposed on them. When I was in Venice a few weeks ago, I was actually staying, in fact, just in this building here, which is right on the edge of the ghetto. The Venetians, the Jews in Venice, were required from 1516 to live in this very restricted area of the city. But within that city, they had total self-government. They were totally autonomous. They ran their own systems, they had their own law courts, they had their own schools, their own hospitals. They governed themselves entirely within this area. And so popular was it that Jewish communities elsewhere in Italy said, can we please have a ghetto too? The ghetto then didn't have the sort of horrific implications and connotations it has now. That was an area of freedom and safety and security for the Jews. And effectively that's what the Venetians did for everyone. They said to everyone, run your own communities. The whole thing is decentralized down. Local policing was run by local communities, schools, charities, hospitals, everything was devolved down to the lowest feasible level of the society. And at no point did the Venetians try to create a single uniform religious identity. What I have here on the right-hand side is one of my favorite synagogues in Venice. This is the upper level of the synagogue, this little light place here. I like this photograph partly because you can't take it any longer. Just here, just on the left-hand side now, they built a really ugly ticket office. So it's impossible now to take that photograph. It's a real shame because it's a nice little corner of the ghetto. I'm told by locals that it's only a temporary ticket office, but temporary in Venice tends to be about 150 years, so I'm not holding my breath. But within the ghetto in Venice, there were 6 rival synagogues from different types of Jewish community. Jews could believe whatever they wanted. They could go wherever they wanted during the day in Venice. Everybody else could go into the ghetto. Everybody else could believe anything they wanted to believe, change their religion any number of times they liked, except, of course, the Catholics. The Catholics were told they couldn't change their religion, but everyone else, they could be free. And I think this is a really interesting example of how we can think about problems like this now in our own time. What was the consequence of Venice having this decentralized, devolved down system? The consequence was that it was just about the only society in 16th, 17th century Europe that didn't have religious wars, civil wars, mass persecutions, mass expulsions, and mass murder. It's the most peaceful, stable society in Europe. Now, of course, I'm not saying if we do what the Venetians did, our society would be peaceful and orderly as well. You can't really make those neat connections in the way that you can with the sciences, I think. Karl Popper, a very famous philosopher years ago, divided scientific problems into two. He said some are like clocks, where you know exactly what the working of the system is, and cause and effect are very simple. Some are like clouds. It's a bit more complicated, but still more or less manageable. I'm afraid the history of human societies is much more difficult than either of those. And there's no neat correlation between cause and effect, between problem and solution. But what studying a place like Venice can help us to do, I think, is just think about the problems we have from a different perspective. Precisely because Venice was so different then, as it's different now, it makes us approach the problems of our own time, I think, in a different way. How could we go about creating a more orderly, peaceful, tolerant society? Not necessarily doing everything the Venetians do, but if you think what the Venetians did do, it makes you think about our own times in a very different way. And I think that's the way history can solve, or help solve, real-world problems. It makes us approach them in a very, very different way. And that's got to be a good thing. Thank you very much.